ready to start? We're okay. That good? All right, fine, good. I want to remind people who are taking it for credit that you should make sure you sign in. So I know you've been here and don't have to set you a 20-page paper. Anyway, all right. I always think it's useful in Marx's text to try to keep in mind a sort of a map of where we've been and what we're doing. So I thought I would start with a little resume of some of the earlier sessions. The first session, if you recall, is essentially about the question of totality and its moments. That is, Marx is looking at the way in which classical political economy has handled questions of the relations between production, distribution, exchange, consumption, realization, and the like. And Marx himself is saying that the way this is set up in classical political economy misses something, and it misses it because it doesn't have a concept of the totality. And that we need a concept of the totality in order to understand the internal relations between all of those moments. And this is then what Marx is sort of laying out in the first section, and clearly one of the ideas that's going to be pursued throughout the text is how to get to a better understanding of the totality and its moments and the relations that exist between the different moments within the totality. The totality, however, has to be understood not as simply an idea. Now, at some point or other, we need the idea, we need to get a representation of the totality, so it's not as if there is not a mission to try to represent it in the realm of ideas. But the totality is itself not created by the ideas. The ideas do not get imposed upon it, as it were. The totality is something that grows, and Marx uses the analogy that it's organic. I would say it's ecosystemic, that it is got many, many different facets interacting, and that it is a historical product as far as Marx is concerned. So we have to look at the historical process which brings the totality into being, in which the moments start to interact with each other, and through their interactions reshape the totality. So the totality is something which is in continuous evolution. And therefore our thought and our representation of the totality also has to be in continuous evolution. We have to try to keep pace with what is happening on the ground, as it were, in the realm of ideas. And this is Marx taking the notion of the totality and its moments and saying these have to be treated according to the principles of historical materialist investigation, which is always about starting with processes occurring on the ground. So having laid that out, Marx then, in the next section on money, is going to ask some questions about the first moment in my representation of the totality, which is that diagram that I'm always sort of flashing at you, this one, where you start with the money and so money being the first moment. Now, Marx is here obsessed, of course, very much with the Proudhon and his ideas about it, and what he wants to combat is the idea that somehow or other the totality can be transformed simply by getting hold of the money and revolutionizing the monetary system. And Marx plainly thinks that that is a crazy idea, so he spends a lot of time trying to disabuse us of that. But in the process, I think he does something very significant, which is to take the notion of money and say, well, there are many things that money is doing in society, but money capital is a very specific aspect of the totality that we're going to look at, and that therefore we have to look at the circulation of money capital and the way in which money capital gets launched into this system, understanding that not all money is capital, but capital is always money at a certain point of its process of circulation, and that therefore the monetary moment is important to understand in its own right, but you don't attribute to the monetary moment all of the powers that Proudhon and the others typically did assign to it. That then leads Marx into the first sort of cut at getting into the question of, all right, well, what is capital? We've got money which is being used as capital, so what is capital? And much of what then follows in this week, but also in subsequent weeks, is trying to come to terms with exactly what is capital. And the first cut of it is to kind of say, well, money capital is about money being used to make more money. And that therefore we have to look upon capital not as a thing, and this is something where he's very critical of classical political economy, because capital was always considered as a thing which got introduced into production, but Marx says capital is not a thing and takes the view that capital is a process. It's a process which is not simply about circulation, it's a process which is about production and circulation taken together. It's a process which is engaged in a spiral form rather than a cyclical form. The spiral takes over, that therefore it is a system which is continuously multiplying. So if you like, the basis that then Marx comes to in the third session is to say capital is defined as a process, and it's a process which is in continuous expansion and endless accumulation. And that endlessness is attached to the desire for more wealth, and so there is also a psychological aspect to this which Marx takes up to some degree, which is the drive that people have for more and more wealth, and that drive is very much behind what the capitalist is doing when they take money capital and launch it into circulation in a certain way. But if it is in continuous expansion, this poses a very serious problem, because if it is expanding through the market system, then the market is characterized by an exchange of equivalence. So the big question is, how can a system which is based on equivalence of exchange actually expand and grow? Where does the growth come from? And that is not covered last week, and that is the theory of surplus value, which is where we're at this week. So this is, if you like, the week when we move from simply about money as expanding to answer the question, how does it expand, and what is the mechanism of expansion? So there is, like I say, this flow in the argument, and when we know where we are in the argument, then it seems to me the book itself becomes less intimidating, because this week there are pages and pages and pages which are about thalers and how much thaler this went into that, which frankly drive me nuts, and I don't want to have to spend much time talking about it. So when you're looking at this, you're saying, what is all this doing here? You can sort of see what it's doing there, but that's the sort of thing where I kind of say, well, in terms of the macro story we're looking at, I'm not so sure this is terribly relevant. So you can read it and see if you get anything out of it, but frankly, I'm not going to be very concerned with that in this session. But the starting point here is, I think, very interesting in this section. And Marx starts off by taking up that where he left off last week, but then says this: the end of the process of production, which was begun with the presuppositions of capital, capital appears to have vanished. as a formal relation. That's because capital has become a commodity, or has now becoming a production process. So capital itself seems to have vanished as a formal relation. Then this can have taken place only because the invisible threads which draw it through the process have been overlooked. Now, this idea of the invisible threads is, I think, something which we should spend a little time thinking about. It is something that crops up very much around the question of what is value. Value is crucially important in all of this, but value is also immaterial but objective. That's what he says in Capital. In Capital, he also talks about the phantom objectivity of value. And here we're talking about invisible threads. And this is rather difficult, I think, to deal with, in part because the imaginary of what Marx is about is that he's a materialist. So how can you have a materialist analysis which talks about invisible threads? How can you have a materialist analysis which is talking about phantom objectivities? And Marx obviously loves the phantom side of things and talks about that kind of thing. So how can you be a materialist and then say the invisible threads are crucial and the like? And of course it has everything to do with the fact that Marx is not so interested in things as he is interested in the social relations. And the way in which I think you could think of this is, imagine that you see somebody digging a ditch. And you could describe in great detail, what the energy is going into digging the ditch, how deep the ditch is, and how long it takes to dig so much of the ditch, and you can, all these physical things, and you can describe all of the physicality of digging the ditch. But at the end of the day, that wouldn't tell you what you would really want to know. Because you would really want to know if the person digging the ditch is digging it as a wage laborer, is digging it as a slave, is digging it as part of some collective Minga thing in Ecuador or wherever, indigenous kind of collective labor system, or is just some insane aristocrat who just likes to take exercise by digging ditches and filling them with things, I mean, but how do you find that out? Can you, by looking at the process, actually say which of those it is? No, the answer is you have to go and ask. Are you a wage laborer? Are you a slave? Are you, a serf? This is common, And for Marx, the most important thing about digging the ditch is not digging the ditch, but who digs the ditch and the nature of the social relation which exists. And the social relation is not something that is immediately obvious. Yes, there may be physical signs of what the social relation is. I mean, if the person digging the ditch has an overseer there with a whip, you kind of got a pretty good understanding that this is not free wage labor, and it's not a collective communal activity. But what Marx, I think, is wanting us to do is to say the social relation is critical. And right throughout, this is one of the things that comes back again and again and again in Marx. The social relations are critical. This is one of the things where he's so critical of Proudhon, because Proudhon does not look at the social relations and doesn't kind of say, okay, if you don't change the social relations, then you don't change capital. And what is interesting is, so frequently you find socialist thinking is about changing the actual physical world in some way, creating more of the stuff so that you can distribute more of the stuff to people. But Marx's argument is, no, what you've really got to look at is changing the social relations. So what is the social relation, which is absolutely central to capital and what capital is about? Well, of course, it's going to be the class relation. It's going to be the relation between capital and labor. And it's that social relation which is critical. And there can be no socialist solution, no anti-capitalist movement that doesn't address the criticality of that social relation. If the social relation remains intact. Now, attached to the social relation are modes of thought, modes of activity, forms of organization, institutional arrangements, legal structures, and all the rest of it. But at the heart of it, Marx is saying, look carefully, always, at the social relation and the nature of the social relation. And this is what the invisible threads are about. He's saying, just because you don't see capital at work in the labor process, and you can't tell from examining the labor process what the social relation is, doesn't mean the social relation is unimportant. In fact, the social relation is going to be critical, always. And this is, I think, one of Marx's central contributions, is to always draw our attention to the nature of the social relations. And I think this is kind of, a fascinating thing. I mean, I've come across communal efforts to do this or that. You can get workers' collectives or something like that. But if the social relation doesn't change, and the social relation has a way of coming back, then you find something that started out as a socialist enterprise suddenly becomes capitalistic. An interesting example of that would, of course, be something like the Israeli kibbutz, understood initially as a completely different kind of social order, but the social relation gradually creeps back in, and the social relations in which the kibbutz is embedded are such as to, as Lefebvre would say it, that something different can happen for a while, but then it gets reabsorbed into the dominant praxis, which reabsorbed into the dominant social relations in Israeli society, in which case it no longer had its socialist content, and that socialist content disappeared. So Marx is here kind of saying, all right, well, we have to look at the social relation. And that is the invisible thread. And he takes this up, and I'm just going to jump ahead and say, if you jump from 304 to 308, 309, many people, I think, have an understanding of this. And on 309, he kind of says, he talks about Ricardo, Sismondi, and so on, and talking about labor. And then he says, then they do not conceive capital in its specific character as form, as a relation of production reflected into itself, but think only about its material substance, raw material, etc. But these material elements do not make capital into capital. Then, however, they recall that capital is also, in another respect, a value, that is, something immaterial, something indifferent to its material consistency. Thus, and he quotes here Say, who Marx doesn't generally like, saying, capital is always an immaterial essence, because it is not material which makes capital, but the value of this material, a value which has nothing corporeal about it. That is, you cannot go to a commodity. All right, this book is a commodity. How do I find out its value? Can I start dissecting it, looking for atoms of value? No, you can't. And if you can't find the value in it, then what are you going to do? Throw the book away? Well, I guess if you're a right-winger you would, but this is... But Marx is kind of saying, no, the value is there. But you just don't see it, and you can't see it. And it's therefore immaterial. But because it's immaterial does not mean it is just totally phantom-like and that it has no objective meaning. And this idea of things which are immaterial but objective is again something that just comes back again and again in Marx's thinking and in his presentation. And it's not difficult to follow. I mean, I know it sounds a little fantasy-like, but, you know, thoughts are immaterial. I mean, where can you find a thought? But thoughts have objective consequences, right? So if thoughts have objective consequences, then the relationship between the immaterial and the objective is actually about consequential thoughts. So that's what Marx is heading for here. And capital is like that. Capital is centered on value, and value is immaterial but objective. It is the invisible thread which pins all of this circulation process together, so that in this circulation process, value has the monetary form, then it has the commodity form, then it has the production form, then it has the commodity form, then it has the money form, and it comes back round. So value takes these different forms, but value itself is indifferent to those forms. Value is what is the invisible thread. And we have to follow value in order to understand the dynamics of this whole process that we're looking at. So Marx then goes on to say, well, okay, the first result is this. Capital becomes the process of production through the incorporation of labor into capital. Initially, however, it becomes the material process of production, the process of production in general. That is, all economic systems have production. So the process of production, the physicality of it, is not unique to capitalism. The process is general. So he then goes on to say what we're going to be looking at here is the labor process. What is the process pushing the expansion when we know, and this comes up several times in this section, when we know that this cannot occur through circulation if the circulation is based upon market exchange, which is based on the exchange of equivalents. That is, you cannot get a surplus value out of market exchange relations. There can be particular cases where a merchant will be able to do that, but if you rob Peter to pay Paul, there's no aggregate expansion. Capitalist system is about aggregate expansion. There has to be a mechanism for the aggregate expansion, and Marx is here saying it's likely that this process of expansion is going to lie in the labor process. So we need to dissect the labor process. So we go from this idea of ultimate expansion to, all right, let's inspect the labor process. But in the labor process, you can't see capital, right? You can't see value. You can't even see value being made or congealed. Yet it is. It's the hidden form. So he's going to say, look, when we look at the labor process abstractly, this is on 304, in terms of its pure materiality, we find something that is common to all forms of production. And that commonality is something which is actually embedded in capital. In exactly the same way that I mentioned about digging the ditch could be all kinds of different modes of production. So capital, in effect, is one mode in which the generality of ditch digging and processes and all the rest of it can be articulated. So he then starts to look at this. And capital is something which is going to reproduce and increase its value. Well, how does it do it in the process of, in the labor process? Now, I don't know if you spend time looking at the footnote on 305. It is a rather interesting one, because it is taking up the question of what is productive labor. Productive labor is something which produces value and maintains value. So what happens here is that Marx is going to argue that capital does not exist without labor. Now, the way we would tend to think of things would be to say, well, okay, there's a capital over there and then there's labor over there. And Marx's argument is no. Capital is something that only arises because labor is incorporated in that labor process and that under that social relation. In other words, it's the importation of the social relation that creates the distinction between labor and capital. Because otherwise you would just end up with the idea that everything is just work. And there would be no distinction between capital and labor. So capital arises when labor becomes incorporated in the product in a certain kind of way and appropriated in a certain kind of way so that the capitalist comes into existence through what labor does. So it is the laborer who creates capital. And of course it's the capital which is going to return to dominate labor, but it's labor which creates the capitalist. And so Marx is going to play that kind of dialectical game. But this question of what is productive labor, and Marx is fairly explicit here on 305 and in this little footnote, productive labor is only that which produces capital. Is it not crazy, asks CG, or at least something similar, Mr. Senior, that the piano maker is a productive worker but not the piano player? Although obviously the piano would be absurd without the piano player, and then he talks about this for a little bit. Now, this is actually wrong, because there are situations in which somebody can make a piano without it being a commodity, without it being sold. In other words, you either say, well, pianos are only built under capitalism, or you say, well, there's a possibility to build a piano in a completely different way. It's easier with other musical instruments. For instance, if you take a guitar or you take a flute or something like that, and, people make them for themselves. That's not productive labor in the sense that it's producing surplus value for the capitalist. It's just producing it's just worker producing a guitar or making a flute or something of that kind. But in this case, Marx is saying the piano maker reproduces capital. The pianist only exchanges his labor for revenue. Okay. But then it turns out the pianist, if they're hired by a capitalist, to play nice songs in a bar somewhere, but actually then the pianist is creating value for the bar owner. So actually this example is wrong. Why?
I think a flute is not at all a piano.
No, I know a flute's not a piano, but yeah, of course. But my point is that you could imagine a communal operation in which the piano would be produced communally, not as a Steinway for the Steinway company.
Because probably the material is much easier when you need just a piece of wood,
Yes.
flute.
Yes.
But to make a piano, you need a lot of different.
Yes, but you could still do that communally.
Yeah, really. Yeah.
It's in principle. You could have a socialist commune, and people would get together and make a piano. I mean, it's possible.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, and then again, it's a social relation. Yeah. Now, actually, what Marx does, if you go to, there's another interesting point where he puts it, which is on 329. It's the bottom of 328, where, in fact, he changes his position to refute the stuff about the piano player, because he says actors are productive workers. not insofar as they produce a play, but insofar as they increase their employer's wealth. Right? So a pianist could employ, So, the example he uses here on this productive and unproductive labor is kind of a bit wonky. Well, this happens in the Grundrisse, right? You've got to get used to this sort of thing happening. I mean, he launches into it and he doesn't think and he doesn't go back and correct it and so on. But this statement here that there's a difference between the piano maker as a productive worker and the pianist is not. Well, if you kind of say what is productive is whoever produces wealth for the capitalist, well, in fact, that could be both in piano or not in piano. So the criterion is that productive worker is somebody who produces surplus value for capital. That's the definition of a productive worker. In Capital, Marx is very explicit about that. He says, okay, the notion of the productive worker is somebody who produces wealth for the capitalist. But nevertheless, in the bottom of this sort of footnote, Marx is kind of saying labor becomes productive only by producing its own opposite.
What page are you on?
305. And it gets back to this: what is the social relation between the laborer and the capitalist, and how is value transferred through the labor process to the capitalist? And so he goes on to explain this on 306 when he says a use value for capital. Labor is a mere exchange value for the worker. Again, Marx is not using his own terminology correctly here, because it's not labor which is a mere exchange value for the worker, it's labor power. And he later on is going to distinguish between labor and labor power. The laborer is not sold. Labor power is sold. And that is the distinction between wage labor and the slave. Is the slave is sold, the laborer is sold, the worker is sold under slavery. In wage labor, the worker is not sold, the labor power is sold. So if that's the case, then there's a big question. If labor power is sold, then what is the value of labor power? And this goes on 307, where he kind of says, the worker therefore sells labor, and again it should be labor power, as a simple predetermined exchange value determined by a previous process. He sells labor itself as objectified labor. He sells labor only insofar as it already objectifies a definite amount of labor, hence insofar as its equivalent is already measured, given. Capital buys it as living labor, as the general productive force of wealth, activity which increases wealth. It is clear, therefore, that the worker cannot become rich in this exchange, since in exchange for his labor capacity as a fixed, see there it's labor capacity, as a fixed available magnitude, he surrenders its creative power, like he saw his birthright for a mess of pottage. Rather, he necessarily impoverishes himself. And then we get towards the bottom of the 307, we're going to, thus the productivity of his labor in general, insofar as it is not a capacity but a motion, real labor, comes to confront the worker as an alien power. Capital, inversely, realizes itself through the appropriation of alien labor. So again, it's this alien capital, alien labor, which Marx has set up before, which meets in the labor process. And there is that inversion, if you like. And this then leads Marx to kind of say, well, you know, when you start to look at this, we see a whole raft of consequences. And he lists these on 308, a longish passage, where he says, thus all the progress of civilization, or in other words, every increase in the powers of social production, in the productive powers of labor itself, such as results from science, inventions, division and combination of labor, improved means of communication, creation of the world market, machinery, etc., enriches not the worker, but rather capital. Hence it only magnifies again the power dominating over labor, increases only the productive power of capital. Since capital is the antithesis of the worker, this merely increases the objective power standing over labor. So the labor creates the capitalist, and then the capitalist has the power, is empowered to dominate labor. So this is the kind of social relation which we're looking at. Labor, he says on 308, itself is productive only if absorbed into capital, where capital forms the basis of production and where the capitalist is therefore in command of production. The productivity of labor becomes the productive force of capital, just as the general exchange value of commodities fixes itself in money. So this is about a transposition of the productive force of labor into the power of capital. Wage labor, he says, presupposes capital, so that from its standpoint as well, capital in this transubstantiation, so he uses this phrase, transubstantiation. That's what goes on in terms of the transfer of productive capacity and power from labor to capital. The necessary process of positing its own powers as alien to the worker. That is, the worker is not actually interested in their own productive capacities and powers because they're alien. They're alienated, they're appropriated. And that gets around to this idea that capital is always an immaterial essence. This is better explained, I think, on 310 and 311. That is, that what we're looking at here is the coming into being, the process of becoming of capital. And again, this idea of a process. Capital is a process, but capital as a process is not something that's given. It's something that has to arise. And the becoming of it is important. We are present, he says, at the process of its becoming. This dialectical process of its becoming is only the ideal expression of the real movement. This comes back to the argument earlier. Marx is always interested in the real movement, but interested in how do we depict that real movement in the world of thought. This dialectical process is only the ideal expression of the real movement through which capital comes into being. The later relations are to be regarded as developments coming out of this germ, but it is necessary to establish a specific form in which it is posited at a certain point. That is, hitherto, capital has been regarded from its material side as a simple production process. This is 310 to 311. But from the side of its formal specificity, this process is a process of self-realization. Self-realization includes preservation of the prior value as well as its multiplication. And then he goes on, value enters as subject. Labor is purposeful activity. That is, somehow or other the laborer has to be animated or forced or coerced or brought into a production process which is going to produce wealth for capital and is going to produce capital. And it's going to, as it were, occupy the production process in such a way as to answer the question of how do you get an inequality out of an exchange system based upon the equality of exchange. This only happens, however, when you go through this whole circulation process. And again, what Marx is reluctant to do is to say you could just understand it in itself. No, you've got to understand the totality, and it's its positionality in the totality which becomes very important. Because what this does is to say that this process of circulation is such that at the point of production, labor is going to be mobilized to produce wealth for the capitalist. But that wealth which is produced for the capitalist is not sort of delivered directly to the capitalist, because the capitalist takes what the laborer has done and takes it into the market and sells it and starts to send it into circulation. Which leads Marx to argue on 312, what is really being posited here is that there is going to be a higher exchange value in circulation, but that is a higher value that cannot originate out of circulation itself, in which in its simple character only equivalents are exchanged. Therefore, if it comes out of circulation as a higher exchange value, it must have entered into it as such. Here's the hidden thread. The hidden thread has done something within the production process to produce a higher exchange value than existed. But you only realize that exchange value when you take it to market. How do you know that you've got surplus value? Well, you look at the money you started out with and the money you ended up after you sell the commodity, and you see you've made something called profit. And this represents the expansion. And Marx is kind of saying the expansion occurred somehow in the production process. But that production process does something else. And this gets him in 313 onwards into a fairly extended discussion. That if exchange cannot create value, then the production process has to not only create the value, but it has to preserve the value that already exists. Marx's formulation is constant capital plus variable capital, C plus V, usually put in those terms. But C plus V is the value of the means of production plus the value of labor power. Those values have to be preserved. Those values have to be preserved even in a situation where the commodity which is made, which is bearer of those exchange values, disappears from circulation because it's eaten or used up or whatever. So the use value is consumed, but the value is maintained. So it's not as if you've produced a hamburger and there's a certain value of the hamburger, and when the hamburger's eaten, the value is eaten as well. No, the value of the hamburger is preserved while, as a use value, it's eaten. So there's been a transubstantiation, there's been a transfer of value from the hamburger into the monetary form before it's eaten. If it's eaten before it's sold, then you're in trouble, right? So again, what Marx is saying here is you can't understand this dynamic without understanding the circulation process. Because what the circulation process does is to take you from the production process into the commodity which is taken to market. which is then sold for the money, and after it is sold for the money, the commodity itself drops out of circulation. Unless, of course, it's one of those commodities that comes back because it's machinery to be used in productive consumption. But what we're looking at here is final consumption. So materially, the commodity drops out. The value, which has been both preserved in the commodity and augmented by the surplus value, that value is retained. And that continues in the spiral form because of the increase that's occurred, which allows for further increase. Now, this leads Marx from 318 on to all kinds of diversions. One diversion is the kind of question of interest. Well, what happens if you've borrowed some money and you owe interest? Shouldn't we incorporate that into the discussion somehow or other? Is it independent or is it not? And Marx is kind of saying, well, okay, that's an issue, but I can't really end up handling it here. That has to wait until Volume 3 of Capital and the Theory of Distribution. What about the robbery of asset values? And he introduces the whole kind of question on 319 of original accumulation and the like. So there are various ways in which historically you might see a seeming expansion in the system. And it may be a real expansion in the system. And if you have usurers who are demanding high interest rates, then people will actually therefore capture the monetary forms and the like. But this then leads him on 321 to get round finally to the kind of question of the theory of surplus value, which is the theory that he's driving to try to set up. And he says, the surplus value which capital has at the end of the production process, a surplus value which, as a higher price of the product, is realized only in circulation, but like all prices is realized in it by already ideally presupposed to it, determined before they enter into it. This surplus value signifies, is expressed in accord with the general concept of exchange value, that the labor time objectified in the product or amount of labor, the magnitude of labor appears as an amount of space, but expressed in motion it is measurable only in time, but that value is greater than that which was present in the original components of capital. This in turn is possible only if the labor objectified in the price of labor is smaller than the living labor time purchased with it. So here we get into the kind of question of the distinction between the value of labor power, which is fixed by the value of the commodities needed to reproduce the laborer at a given standard of living, the distinction between the value of labor power and the value which that labor power can create in production. And what the capitalist does is to use their newfound power, which is given to them by labor, to force the laborer to produce the surplus value. And that is done by this calculation of the amount of hours which are needed, and the whole kind of theory of surplus value is laid out on page 334, 24 to 5. As he says, if however, this is 324 middle, if however only half a working day is necessary in order to keep one worker alive one whole day, then the surplus value of the product is self-evident. The only thing which can make him into a capitalist is not exchange, but rather a process through which he obtains objectified labor time, i.e. value, without exchange. Half the working day costs capital nothing. It thus obtains a value for which it has given no equivalent. and the multiplication of values can take place only if a value in excess of the equivalent has been obtained, hence created. So here's the definition. Surplus value in general is value in excess of the equivalent. The equivalent, by definition, is only the identity of value with itself. Hence, surplus value can never sprout out of the equivalent, nor can it do so originally out of circulation. It has to arise from the production process of capital itself. The great historic quality of capital is to create this surplus labour, superfluous labour from the standpoint of mere use value, mere subsistence. And its historic destiny is fulfilled as soon as, on one side, there has been such a development of needs that surplus labour above and beyond necessity has itself become a general need arising out of individual needs themselves. And on the other side, when the severe discipline of capital, acting on succeeding generations, has developed general industriousness as the general property of the new species. So then this stuff comes back echoing what we've already done, which is to recognize that the driving force is the multiplication of capital and its expansion. And this is a general expansion which also affects the labourer and comes back and infects the labourer. In 325 he says, capital's ceaseless striving towards the general form of wealth drives labour beyond the limits of its natural paltriness, and thus creates the material elements for the development of the rich individuality, which is all-sided in its production as in its consumption, and whose labour also therefore appears no longer as labour, but as the full development of activity itself, in which natural necessity in its direct form has disappeared, because a historically created need has taken the place of a natural one. This is why capital is productive. Find this interesting. You're looking at the way in which capital becomes productive. And the way it becomes productive is by changing the productivity of labour. So that labour is now being governed, dominated if you like, by capital. But that domination also is connected to a transformation of needs, needs which go beyond natural necessity. As he says, a historically created need has taken the place of a natural one. Now, then he gets into sort of discussions of various ways in which people have thought about surplus value. And there's a whole discussion of the Physiocrats, with whom Marx is fairly sympathetic. The Physiocrats basically took the view that all value arose out of agriculture and agricultural production. Marx obviously is not going to ride with that, but on the other hand, he's very sympathetic to the position the Physiocrats took, which is that productive labour is going to create the value. But in the Physiocrats' case, it was productive labour on the land which did it, and everything else was secondary. In a way, this is sort of a bit understandable, because during the period when the Physiocratic view was strongest, most manufacturing activity was conducted in small workshops, and it wasn't a factory system or anything of that kind, and the small workshops were largely attached to the aristocracy, were making beautiful things for the aristocracy. You know, this is the kind of thing when you go to the chateau in Versailles, you see the kind of thing we're talking about, and that labour was considered parasitic, and there's a sense in which it was, because it rested upon the base of a vast amount of exploitation of living labor in the agricultural sector, and the industrial sector was seen as something which was sort of placed on top of that. So the Physiocrats had this kind of idea and tried to work with this idea, and Marx is sort of sympathetic to it, but then kind of said, well, this is not the situation that we are dealing with. This is something really quite different. But he also recognizes, and this is an important idea which I tried to incorporate a bit in the diagram, that labor is actually affected by the natural conditions under which it is performed. So Marx talks about, yes, it's alien labor, but there is something which we call the gifts, the free gifts of nature, which he mentions on 330. In Adam Smith, for example, said, well, labor in principle is a source of value, it's also a source of wealth, but actually labor too posits surplus value only insofar as in the division of labor the surplus appears as just as much a gift of nature, a natural force of society, as the soil with the Physiocrats. So the surpluses were frequently augmented by higher fertility, natural fertility, and all the rest of it. So if that was the case, then this had clearly an effect upon the use values that could be produced with a certain amount of labor input. And of course this means that rents can also arise out of this, that the landlord who has the more fertile land is likely to say, well, we're going to have to charge higher rents on that. So what this leads into is, of course, that land, labor, and capital are founded on the class relation of landlords, capitalists, and laborers. And the concept of capital, therefore, has to be set in that kind of context in the Physiocratic period. But then merchant capital and the mercantilist position comes in. So Marx briefly considers on 332 mercantile capital. Then recognizes also, well, bankers come into it, so there are all sorts of ways in which the surplus can be appropriated and used, and the connectivity between surplus value production and all of these other forms of capital becomes part of the story. But this then brings us back to something which we're going to encounter again and again in the Grundrisse. On 334, clearly the value of labor power is something which is variable, and if you can drive the value of labor power down, then there is more surplus value. Clearly the value of labor power is attached to a certain length of the working day, so you can augment surplus value by lengthening the working day. So there are all these kind of things going on between capital and labor. And the capitalist can find ways to work the laborer harder, longer hours, or those kinds of things, or for less and less wages, and maximize their surplus value. But this does not in itself suggest that there is a natural limit to the wealth which capital can appropriate. And so he says on 334, as representative of the general form of wealth, money capital is the endless and limitless drive to go beyond its limiting barrier. Every boundary is and has to be a barrier for it, else it would cease to be capital. Money is self-reproductive. If ever it perceived a certain boundary, not as a barrier, that became comfortable within it as a boundary, it would itself have declined from exchange value to use value, from the general form of wealth to a specific substantial mode of the same. Capital as such creates a specific surplus value because it cannot create an infinite one all at once. But it is a constant movement to create more of the same. The quantitative boundary of the surplus values appears to it as a mere natural barrier, as a necessity which it constantly tries to violate and beyond which it constantly seeks to go. Now this idea of endless accumulation and the constant leaping over of all barriers to further expansion of the system is here kind of critical to Marx's presentation. And of course it's one of the arguments that I would certainly make today, that this leaping over barriers and the intent to go even bigger and bigger and further, and the way in which the quantitative boundary of the surplus value never appears to be satisfying to capital. We always need more. And here is Marx kind of saying, this is and again it comes back to the question of the nature of capital. It's not that capital is natural, but that capital has a nature, and this is its nature. And this is its form of abstraction. And here also we go back to the idea that this is, if you like, the phantom objectivity which is driving this, the abstractions. And if you remember, two sessions ago, we were talking a lot about this system is driven by abstractions. Even the capitalist is alienated because they're driven by abstractions. The market is there, and what Marx is trying to do is to say this system has certain qualities which, as it comes into being and as it becomes more powerful and more significant, become undeniable. We are constantly leaping over the boundaries. It always will find ways. In recent times, the credit system. The expansion of the credit system since around 1970 has been phenomenal. Did you know that every single man, woman, child on planet Earth at this point is in debt up to the tune of something like $85,000? Every single human being, $85,000. So before you leave, you have to pay off your debt. Of course, the interesting thing about this is for every debt, there's also a credit. So it means that somebody is owed. And there's a big question, are you a net creditor or a net debtor?
It's an abstraction too.
Yes. But it's a powerful one, and it has objective meaning. 85,000, you know. And in the 1970s, if any entity was in debt, for instance, there was always this debt to GDP ratio. And if you went above 70 or 80%, it was considered to be really dangerous. So you would go and discipline Mexico, or you'd discipline all of those countries because they had too much debt relative to their GDP, when the ratio was around 70 or 80%. The global debt right now in relationship to global GDP is something like 230 or 240%. Which would have been, now this is what we call leaping over barriers. And you just go look at some of the graphs. A very good place to go, by the way, is there's something called FRED, which is the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and it collects all this data and it gives you all these graphs. And there's a graph of indebtedness, which is exponential growth of indebtedness. There's a graph of world money supply, which just goes. So this is the leaping over barriers, and it's in capital's nature to do it. And here's Marx saying in 1858, he's saying, look, this is the nature of the beast. This is what is coming into being. This is what is becoming. And this is what we could expect from this system. These are the abstractions which are driving it. And capital can't do anything about it because capital is alienated too. And in particular, it's going to be alienated. He doesn't use this term here, but in Capital he uses it frequently. He kind of talks about the coercive laws of competition. The coercive laws of competition force capital to do certain things. The laws of motion of capital. And that's what Marx is trying to say. We should try to understand these laws of motion of capital. And as we understand these laws of motion of capital, we understand what it is that capital might have to do, not what it wants to do or what the evil spirits amongst the capitalists are doing. No, it's nothing to do with that. It's the nature of the abstractions which are driving this system. And I think what is so remarkable about Marx in this literature is the way in which he starts to recognize what the nature of capital is about and what it is likely to do. It is a system out of control. There is no control on it. And in fact, what he's saying here is it cannot stand any kind of control. And then, of course, we have the mentality, which is about deregulation of everything, and that therefore everything should be decontrolled. Because the abstraction of the market is going to, this is the Adam Smith view, the abstraction of the market is going to drive the system in such a way as to be to the benefit of all. And what Marx is kind of saying, of course, says in Capital, is it's not to the benefit of all, and in any case it's driving the system to expand so that, you know, the constant sort of expansion of use values and all of that creates a humongous sort of waste problem. In the same way that it creates a huge increase in carbon emissions and all those other things. So, you know, you can sort of slot into this little account here, 334, 335, about endless and limitless drive to go beyond its limiting barriers. Every boundary is and has to be a barrier for it. Else it would cease to be capital. Okay. Now, when I make an argument that I'm an anti-capitalist, this is the reason I'm an anti-capitalist. Everybody thinks it's because I've got something wrong with my DNA or something. Obviously, I don't understand the beauty of this system. But it's, I tell you, you read a passage like this and do what I did this one, which I do regularly every morning, is I turn on Bloomberg Financial News. And everybody's kind of saying, you know, we're not growing fast enough. No, well, no, how are we going to get there? You know, where are we? How can we position ourselves better so that we take advantage of this and that? I mean, the whole news channel is a celebration of the continuous expansion of capital and the continuous overcoming of any barriers which get in the way of anything. And the idea that guy may become president is, you know, well, it's almost as insane as the one we currently have. But this is what Marx is revealing. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't really go much further with that. He then takes up tedious calculations of God knows what, thalers and more thalers, and you know, I don't know why he got into that. He recognizes, of course, that there are certain barriers which are difficult to circumvent. He mentioned some of these on 340, because he starts immediately to get into the idea that one of the things that's going to have to change is continuous increase in the productivity of labour, in the physical productivity of labour, and that therefore innovations for productivity of labour, and what he later called relative surplus value, and he starts to articulate something about relative surplus value, but that there are diminishing returns in productivity, that while you can have huge leaps in productivity from a very low base, then it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain the expansion of the rates of productivity. So this is, I think, a point where there is a certain self-limitation within the dynamics of the system. But like I say, there are all these tedious sort of thalers, and it just goes on for pages and pages. But with occasional flashes of, I think, brilliant commentary, but there's nothing very much that I could find in here. Maybe you found some if you plowed through it, but it's not that. So this takes me up to somewhere around 360, where Marx is here talking about, comes back to the question of labour, and the way in which the value has to be preserved in the process at the same time as it's also surpluses are generated. But all of this, and there's a nice phrasing I always like, and I often quote on page 361, with I think a very brilliant evocative sentence, and in the midst of all of this tedious stuff, where he kind of says, "Labour is the living, form-giving fire. It is the transitoriness of things, their temporality, as their formation by living time. In the simple production process, leaving aside the realization process, the transitoriness of the forms of things is used to posit their usefulness." The transitoriness and temporality is something which is evoking here. He doesn't take it up very much. In fact, one of the things I regret very much is that Marx never attempted to create a chapter of the sort that existed in the Working Day in Capital, where Marx talks about the transformation of the temporality of things, because the changing temporalities of capital are, I think, very, very significant, and we can talk a little bit about that if you want, but that idea of the form-giving fire and the transitoriness of things, again, is Marx evoking something about the nature of capital as an economic system that is going to work in a certain kind of way. So on 365, he offers a summary of where he's been in this stuff. "We see, therefore, that the capitalist, by means of the exchange process with the worker, by indeed paying the worker an equivalent for the costs of production contained in his labour capacity," that is, an equivalent set by the standard of living of labour, i.e. giving him the means of maintaining his labour capacity, but appropriating living labour for himself, so the capitalist takes the living labour, the fire, the fire of labour, obtains two things free of charge. First, the surplus labour, which increases the value of his capital, but at the same time, secondly, the quality of living labour, which maintains the previous labour materialised in the component parts of capital, and thus preserves the previously existing value of capital. But this preservation does not take place as a result of an increase in the amount of labour objectified by living labour, a creation of value, but simply as a result of its existence as living labour in the proper relation with material and instrument. So the preservation of labour is something that occurs on the side, as it were. It's a side benefit. It's a free gift that the labourer gives to capital by preserving the value as well as creating the surplus value. And this prevents a topic which crops up occasionally in the Grundrisse and does so in significant ways, where Marx talks about the possibility of devaluation, which is on 365, that if capital does not grasp the means of production and use them creatively in the production of value and surplus value, then that capital is devalued. So the prospect exists for the devaluation of capital. If this whole circulation process gets blocked, then there's going to be devaluation. One of the impacts of what, the virus in China is going to be significant devaluation. One of the things that happens with wars and things like that is significant devaluation.
Is that the same thing as like what economists call underutilized capacity? Or?
No, because underutilized capacity is, is not destroyed. In fact, Marx has three terms he uses. I mean, this is not in Capital. He talks about destruction, which is physical destruction. He talks about depreciation, which is the loss of monetary value. And he talks about devaluation, which is the loss of the value which is incorporated in there. Now, if a factory stops and all the machine rusts, then you've got devaluation and you've got unused productive capacity, which may then be devalued. It's likely to be depreciated. In some cases, it'll be destroyed. So capital gets, those three terms are not synonymous with each other. In fact, Marx talks about investments in the built environment, where the original value is destroyed, but the use value remains. It's not destroyed. For instance, the tube lines in London were built in such a way, and the companies that built them went bankrupt, so they were devalued, and they sat around for a few years, and then somebody came in and bought them up for almost nothing. But the tunnels were still there, so the use value was still there. And Marx kind of says, well, that's often the way in the built environment, that the first wave of investors goes bankrupt, and then somebody comes in and buys it up dirt cheap, and then they make a success of it. So the depreciation, devaluation, and destruction are sort of part and parcel. Well, here he's talking about devaluation, which is the loss of value that arises. And the loss of value occurs, which would connect to what you're saying, as he says, not because something is not sold or not used, but because it is not sold or used in time. That is, that if you have a depreciation schedule on fixed capital machinery and you can't use it for 5 years, then even though the machinery is still there, you may not be able to pick it up again because it's just too late. So the temporality then becomes important. So he introduces the notion of the potentiality of devaluation, and that's then a significant introduction, but he doesn't do anything much with it. So that actually then brings us, if you like, to the end of this part of Grundrisse. So let me stop here, and maybe we can have some discussion over some issues that arise. Yeah, you have to use the microphone so that we can get it on.
Hi, just a quick question. You talked about the constant expansion of use value, how it creates waste problems. I thought that would be I was hoping you could talk about that a little bit more, because I thought that would be like the constant expansion of exchange values. How is it the use values?
Well, the constant expansion of the use values presumes that there is some place that wants, needs, desires them. So the question of, and if there is no use value, then there's no value. This is Marx. Marx doesn't make that argument here, but if I take my commodity to market and nobody wants or needs it, then the labor incorporated in it is not value. So the expansion of use values on the world market becomes absolutely connected to this constant drive to expand value. In other words, you can't expand value without somehow or other finding use values which are going to be consumed. And not only do you need or desire for it, you also need enough money to pay for it. So if you take this diagram, if you get to the point of the market and you can't transform the commodity into money because nobody is there to buy it, then you've lost your value. There's no value.
But you're being driven because you want to get the exchange values,
Yes,
right? Like
right.
you're driven by, but at the same time you're producing a ton of stuff and
Yeah.
people don't actually use it. So
Yeah.
the use value, wouldn't that be like 0 or lower? Like what's driving them is the exchange value, right? And then that's
Well,
why they're overproducing.
And consumer, why would you
Oh no,
why would you spend a lot of money on something you don't want?
you wouldn't.
No, right. So
But as a capitalist, you're
Yeah.
producing a bunch of stuff people don't need because you're chasing exchange values.
yes, right. But if nobody wants it, then you've lost. So you don't get the exchange value and you don't get the value. So Marx is very explicit about that. That if there is no market for it and if there's no sale, and this is why the totality starts to become important, because you are producing value and surplus value at the point of production. Then the question arises, if it just stays in the point of production, it dies, disappears, it becomes devalued. Okay. So you've got to get it to the next step. So you've got to keep the circulation process going. And the circulation process requires that there be a transition from that point where you've produced something, a commodity, so that you can monetize the commodity and get the money, and then you can go with the money and start doing things. But if you can't make that transition, then you've got devaluation, which is why he introduces the concept of devaluation here just briefly, because he's not to the point now. That it's going to come back later on. And then that also comes back to the question of the barriers. What are the barriers to the constant expansion of this system? One of them is consumer appetite. So one of the things that capital has to do is to actually affect consumer appetites and and how does it do that? Well, there are all sorts of strategies it does that, and that's why the temporality becomes important. Because one of the things it has to do is to push very hard on. In fact, capital is invested increasingly in those spheres of production where the consumption time is very short. Because if consumption time is very long, then there's no expansion. So. This produces what I would call a Netflix economy. I mean, the consumption of a Netflix episode is an hour, That's it. and so there's a lot of value which is put into the creation of the episode, but the consumer time is close to zero. Whereas when you make a house, you've got a consumption time when you're looking at, at least 30, if not 50 years. So if you only made houses, capital would be in a terrible mess. Which is why capital wants to create more and more houses and knock them down again. Portable houses and all the rest of it. So accelerating consumption time is built into the expansion that we're talking about here. And it's interesting. Areas of watch where capital flows in terms of investment. What does it invest in? And most of the fields of real active investment these days are fields where the consumer time is very short. Hmm?
Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing is tourism. Tourism is something that's consumed, So capital has been investing vast amounts in cruise liners, which are probably not going to be so popular in the next few years, given the fact that people have been stuck on them for. So I mean, take for example the vast investment that goes into cruise lines, and that is something that is consumed by people going on a cruise, and that's it. Now this is a field of investment which seems to have, when Marx puts this thing and kind of says, look, there are barriers to be overcome. How do you overcome the barrier of temporality of certain forms of consumption? And so the forms of consumption, which are very short, which is why I like that little thing about form giving fire of labour and the temporality and so on. It's very interesting because it says the temporality has to change. So the temporality, and part of that is also planned obsolescence. For instance, when the telephone was a landline, there was a limited market. Now it's become mobile, and they've become new apps and all that kind of stuff. How many phones have you had over the last 10 years? I'm not asking you to confess, but most of us have had several, right? And the same is true of computers, electronics, and of course video games and all those kinds of things. There's a whole set of, and the qualities of daily life have been absolutely kind of completely reshaped around the requirement that you reduce the consumption time to as close to zero as possible. So also that means spectacle. Spectacles are instantaneously consumed. So Guy Debord was quite correct in 1967 when he wrote The Society of the Spectacle, but he didn't know how important what he was writing was about. So the world, again, Marx is kind of saying these abstractions are ruling us. And so the whole kind of question of temporality, the temporality of things is being transformed. And Marx is kind of saying, yeah, right, whether you'd expect that at a certain point. And therefore the whole kind of structuring of wants, needs and desires. And I always find it great. It's so interesting to look at ads on the TV. All those things where you have this fantasy that you're going to end up on some wonderful beach, with this fantasy vacation. And of course, but all the things that go into that are significant because you've got the airlines, you've got the amount of capital that gets absorbed, not simply in the tourist industry itself, but also in all of the physical infrastructures you need for the tourist industry. But Marx is kind of saying all of this is kind of, if you stick with capitalism, this is what you're going to get. You don't really have much of a choice, unless you kind of say, okay, this beast has gone too far, we need to come up with some other way of organizing political and economic life, which is a kind of a big story. But the interesting thing is that Marx is kind of basically saying, well, you know, this is what we should be thinking about, and you should be understanding the abstractions. But if I go on sort of Bloomberg News and think that I'm going to get anything on there that does anything other than fetishizing the wondrous extractions of this whole thing, as if somehow or other this is utopia in the making. And Marx is kind of saying, well, you know, I'm not so sure it's a utopia in the making. This may be dystopia in the making, and in fact we have a lot of evidence that is indeed what we're witnessing and what we're living with and what we're living through. Sorry, this sounds a bit depressing, doesn't it? I don't mean to discourage you from taking a cruise or getting a new phone or watching Netflix and binge watching, you know. We all do those things because that's what daily life is. But we've got to understand where it comes from, and so Marx, I think, is trying to. And I think it's just very well laid out here, just in this kind of crazy thought experiment that he's engaging in here.
I would like just to ask maybe to go further with the immaterial values, cultural values. So if you have like a music, whenever, how you relate this, because there is always a immaterial collective value in a music piece, which is maybe now, which is not important in a period of time, but gets important like 100 years afterwards. So how I'm much interested in cultural values. So how you think that works out for Marx?
Well, two things. First, I think this question which I've been raising here about the temporality of things has tremendous implications for cultural forms. I think it's intriguing that since the 1970s, the number of museums of everything has shot up, because again, it's a form of consumerism, which is instantaneous in its forms, fits in, of course, with tourism and all the rest of it. When I went to Baltimore in 1969, I think there were 2 museums. Now there are at least 30. And this is not exactly the city that you would imagine would be a cultural center of some kind. But so the point here also would be that you've got to understand cultural industries, and they're now called cultural industries. And what are the industries doing? Well, a lot of them are trading upon authenticity, which is an attempt to gain monopoly rents in some way in a field of, and so if you can do something special and be particular, you can get monopoly rents and monopoly incomes, and so it's a field of highly competitive activities of various kinds. So I think, but then there's the question of the motivations of the people involved, and Marx, I think, has it's not in here. He has an interesting thing where he talks about Milton writing Paradise Lost, and says, well, you know, was this a productive thing to do? What kind of labor was it that went into the writing of Paradise Lost? And Marx's answer was, you know, well, Milton wrote Paradise Lost in exactly the same way that a silkworm spins silk. it was in his nature to write something of that kind. And in itself, it is of course, a content of a certain kind. It started to get commodified when Milton transferred the rights to publish it to a publisher for £5 or something ridiculous like that, and got £5, and so the publisher then will turn it into a book and will sell the book, in which case it becomes a commodity with surplus value with the bookbinders and all the rest of it. But the content is of course something which comes out of human creativity, and this is what Marx talks about when he's talking about the free gifts of labour to capital. That is, it provides the content, and we see a lot of this in other areas. For instance, the development of much of the internet. A lot of it was peer-to-peer, non-remunerated labour, and indeed with some of these other things you probably know more about in Reddit or whatever, that can get organised. But look who's benefited from it. Who's got the monopoly power out of it? Who's stacked up huge wealth out of it? I mean, this is, in a sense, this is exactly like the sort of thing Marx is talking about here, that labour created the capital, and the capital comes back to dominate the labourer, and so the folk who kind of were there doing the peer-to-peer computing and doing all of that kind of stuff, basically living in poverty somewhere, because where all of their innovations have been appropriated and stolen and away. Yeah. So in fields like this, yes, you have a lot of things going on, but also, there are other peculiar aspects to it, like this the whole sponsorship. Everything. So sponsored by British Petroleum or Exxon or whatever, which has a lot to do with branding values and what that's all about, and that's kind of complicated territory to assess also. But you can't take an area like culture and somehow or other treat it as somehow or other outside, because in my view, the culture of daily life is foundational for all of us, and what in effect we've seen as a transformation in the cultures of daily life, which have everything to do with this dynamic which we're looking at here, of getting past barriers and saying, okay, we've got a barrier there, we're not going to, there's not much in the long-term market of making this, we should go off and, recognize the Netflix economy or something like that, which again, there has to be content, and the content is often free gift coming from various sources which capital appropriates. I guess though all of us who are in this would love to be appropriated, provided we're paid enough.
Hey, Dr. Harvey. I just connecting a couple of passages here. I mean, this piece on 361, the labor is the living form giving fire. I mean, this is pretty powerful stuff for those who are the laborers that produce that, right? I mean, that's that really seems to be at the center of the system, as in terms of a social force that could be revolutionary. But then going back to 308 in this piece that says, thus all the progress of civilization, and so on, that passage. And it is just striking to me, in the time he's writing this, and was this 1857, 58, thereabouts, and thinking about his time, but also thinking about our time, this piece of, the labor that leads to, there wouldn't be any of these things produced, in terms of leading to the creation of world market, machinery, and I just think about the way that people then and now are made to feel disconnected, that the capitalists, that this belongs to them, that they're actually the legitimate owners, and they wield this, and in fact, we're just a bunch of dumb workers, even though we've helped produce this, if that makes sense. And just thinking about that time in this, the same year, 1858, here in the U.S., Senator, Hammond from South Carolina, gave the Mudsill speech. He's defending the system of slavery, and he's all the entrapments of being part of the slave power, and he's basically saying, we're the rightful legitimate, in our, we can quote Greek, and we're highly educated, these slaveholders in South Carolina, and it's all built on this system, this order, but at the bottom of which is enslaved black workers producing that cotton. And so, anyway, just connecting that time to this in terms of the ideological and political and social impact of this process. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's important. There are some passages in Marx and also some readings of Marx which tend to emphasize a kind of teleology, that somehow or other it was bad and then it got better and there is progress and all that kind of thing. But certainly we have to pay attention to the transition from one mode of production to another. And I think what Marx is saying here, and he says throughout, is at a certain point this system which we have, which is a capitalist system, driven by its abstractions, that it doesn't have a place for slavery. It has to transcend that mode of production in the same way that it transcended feudalism and so on, which is not to say there are not feudal residuals of slavery, and in fact right now a re-emergence of certain forms of slavery going on. So I think for me, I'd rather avoid the teleology reading that kind of says there's progress here, but at the same time recognize that this system which Marx is talking about, the totality, has been evolving and has created a world which is now radically different from what it was in 1858. And the radical difference is certainly in terms of its technologies, speed up, all of those kinds of things. But the big thing which is very much continued in this, and this is where the invisible thread comes in. The invisible thread is the capital-labor relation, which is foundational. And to the degree that that thread, that invisible thread, that phantom objectivity continues, if you like, to dominate, labor is dominated by capital, even though labor creates capital. So, in a sense, labor is dominated by something it creates. And I think what Marx is trying to do is to say to working people, you're creating them. Withdraw your labor and they're dead. So I think that there's a kind of a positionality or a consciousness that is implied in what Marx is kind of saying. But at the same time, Marx is not going to say that all of those things that have been created in terms of knowledge, in terms of productivity, capacity, all those kinds of things, are evil things. His point would be is, if we change the social relations, how would we use those things? Which of those things would we discard, and which of those things would we want to preserve? And clearly we would want to preserve quite a few of those things. But some of them, we could do without. I mean, so I think his politics here are I think along those lines. At least I read him that way. There are other people who would probably disagree with me. That's how I tend to look at it. But I think that for me anyway, the recognition of the nature of capital and what it is about, and the kinds of things that it is going to produce, and the kinds of dynamics, the dialectics of its own evolution, if you like. That understanding something about that, I think, creates an imperative to start to think about an alternative. How to get there is another question, but what the nature of the beast is important.
Speaking about the distinction between labor and labor power, that what is being sold is the labor power, not the labor, or not the laborer, actually. I can't see the distinction that much, because when we think of where is the site of production, is it the factory or it's life? If it's life, so what is being sold is the labor life. It's the laborer, it's the worker himself, kind of, is being sold. If we sort of the whole debates about social reproduction, it's my life that is being sold out there, and the distinction between my labor force and my life is not that clear for me.
I think what Marx is trying to do is to say that the use value of labor power is something that's defined by capital. The laborer's life is separate from that. And I think the separation is important for Marx, because Marx is kind of very much concerned with a positionality of critique of the labor process as it is organized under capital. If you recall last week when he was sort of talking about the way in which the worker lives and the choice, their life choices and so on, which is given to them by their position as wage laborers, which then says they go into the market as workers, but once they're in the market, they're buyers. And the relationship shifts from capital and labor to buyers and sellers. And as a worker, once you've got your wage, you're free to do with it what you want, up to a level. I mean, there are certain necessities, and of course, one of the things Marx is saying in that section is, by and large, capital tries to drive your necessities down to the cheapest possible wage level, so that you don't have that much discretion. But situations arise in which, he says in Capital at a certain point, that situations arise in which the scarcity of labor is such that wages go up, in which case the golden chain, he says, which connects workers to capital is lengthened, and there's a certain amount of consumer choice which exists. This was a very important idea in the, say, late 1960s, early 1970s, when there was a great deal of discussion of what were called affluent workers. The auto worker with the union who had, lived in a suburban house and had 2 cars in the driveway and a television set, all this kind of stuff. So there was a period when people were kind of saying, well, when I was first started teaching capital, people would always ask me about, well, what about the affluent worker? It's very interesting. Nobody asked me that question anymore because that sort of disappeared. But it disappeared under a political assault from Reagan and Thatcher and all the neoliberals piling in and saying, we got to liberate capital from all of this kind of social welfare stuff, and which is still going on, of course. So yes, but I think what what Marx is trying to do is to say, look, the worker has a positionality, and in a sense this goes back to what was being said earlier. From what positionality can a working class mount a critique of the system in which they have their being? And if they see themselves only as being within that system, then there is no possibility of critique, whereas I think Marx is trying to say, well, outside of that, understand that when you give your labor power, you're just giving your labor power. And it's alienated labor, it doesn't belong to you, your product doesn't belong to you, conditions of labor are set by somebody else. Frequently you're in a situation where you're an appendage of the machine and you just do as the machine instructs, so that you're that. But that is, and he wants to say, that's not life. That's a kind of a living death in a way. So we have to think about what would create an unalienated existence, and actually a lot of things here. I mean, part of the argument that was made in the 1970s and 1980s was to start to talk about compensatory consumerism, in which, in a way, capital seemed to be offering to the worker the sort of Faustian thing of, well, okay, you suffer in the labor process, and you give of your labor, and okay, it's shit, but once you leave the place, you have compensatory consumerism, and you've got all of that cornucopia of all of those wonderful things you can do when you're at home and this kind of stuff. So compensatory consumerism was supposed to counter the alienation of labor by a fulfilling life, but of course it didn't turn out to be that fulfilling, so people have given up on that one too in these times, except to kind of say, well, aren't you enjoying the latest iPhone, and don't you enjoy being on Facebook, and don't you enjoy doing, all of these things, by the way, seem to me to be about actually mopping up people's time so they don't have time to think. I think that this is kind of a very sinister side to a lot of that. But I think that, for Marx anyway, I think the whole kind of question of his aim, I think, is to educate the working class to their condition and their situation and the nature of this process. And to do that, I think he has to create a separate space, or an idea of a separate space, which is somehow outside of this labor relation, and say, well, you have not been bought. Your labor power has been bought, but not you. And I think that's a very important distinction he wants to make.
I want to tease out this invisible thread a little more. You say, and Marx is arguing here, that a lot of it has to do with the subordination of labor power to capital. And I'm thinking in the case of worker-directed and owned firms, in which workers are kind of reversing that social relation to some extent, right? But as asset owners and as and being able to democratically make decisions in the firm, right? It creates a new kind of social relation. But it seems to me that Marx here is also suggesting that there might be another source of notion of that invisible thread or that social relation that is outside of the firm. And I think you're referencing it a little bit when you're referring to the kibbutz, right? That we can develop these worker-owned firms, but if there is still an institution, so I'm just trying to figure out what is it that other, besides the subordination of labor power to capital, could we tease that out a little more?
Yeah, Marx himself, of course, was well aware of these sorts of initiatives, and he was very respectful of Robert Owen and the attempts to create alternatives of that kind. So I don't think he's. When he's saying this is in the nature of capital to do this, and this is what it's about. There's a big. Actually, it's interesting. I can't find him anywhere talking about capitalism. He always talks about capital. And it's the laws of motion of capital not of capitalism. So capitalism is something which is much bigger. And actually, in here you do get, I think, some ideas about capitalism in ways that he tends to exclude from the analysis in his more sort of tightly organized critiques in Capital itself, which is interesting. It is called Capital, not capitalism. So yeah, those processes are always there. There are feudal residuals, which he tends to kind of say, well, I'm not going to be concerned with them, but they certainly continue to play out. I mean, we still have a wretched monarchy in Britain, for example. Let's talk about a feudal residual. It's kind of it's bizarre, so there are, and then there are, of course, all the experiments which are trying to go outside of this. And that's where I think this notion, I always will take from Lefebvre, kind of saying, you know, you can go outside and you can try and construct something, and you may construct something, and it can be constructed for a while. And I think it's very important to do that, and to then start to say, well, how can the whole system be like that? So if you look at something like Mondragon, which is the big kind of collective thing in Spain and that, okay, but if you're in the middle of a capitalist dynamic, it's very hard not to get caught up inside of it. And one of the issues in, for example, Argentina, when there's a lot of recuperated factories and, you know, worker, is that situations arise that through competition, in effect, you become an organizer of your own repression, and this is the problem. So you know, I don't want to be negative about any of these things, but I'm saying that the invisible threads are very pernicious, and they, watch out, they'll get you. The phantom objectivity will come after you, kind of thing. And I think it's interesting he uses that language, and he was very much taken, of course, with Dracula's stories and Shelley and, you know, Frankenstein and all of that sort of stuff. So he was very well aware of that. And of course you get some of that language in Capital, but I don't think that he's trying to say that the capitalist world will be totally dominated by all of this. No, there are many possibilities outside, but he's interested in the internal contradictions within this structure as to how and under what circumstances it might crash, and he clearly sees that it will create barriers to itself at a certain point, which will become insurmountable to itself, and at what point it will do that becomes then a kind of question. Are we out of time, more or less? Okay, I think we must stop there. So next week we do 373 to 423. 373 to 423. Now, I can tell you something about this. The first 20 pages, you're continuing with thalers and, well, read it as fast as you can. The last 20 pages are very rich. I mean, this is what the Grundrisse is like. You know, you're reading it, you kind of go, why am I reading this? You know, but the last 20 pages are very rich. So and do a lot of attention. So it may not be 20, it may be 21, but I can't tell you exactly how. But the last part of this is actually very, very interesting, whereas the first part is Thaler land. Okay, good, thank you.